Gender dysphoria is very complex and can be very difficult to deal with, especially when you deal with it in such a way as I do. It's like a yo-yo. It goes up and down. It can be mild sometimes. It can be in the middle. Sometimes it's much stronger. And these varying degrees, they can go on for days at a time like that. And I've been going to therapy for around 1.5 years. And a lot of what I deal with in therapy is gender dysphoria. I deal with depression as well. 25 years ago, I guess, I was at one time diagnosed bipolar even. So this is some of what I'm doing today to deal with it. Now, why does religion not help me? Why is that a method that did not help me with any of this? It took me a long time and a lot of my life to break out of the program of Christianity and what I would call the Jesus program. And I'll explain further is that the reason why you can't resolve gender dysphoria or depression or these things through a religious program is because typically you're going to repress your feelings. You're going to push things into the back. You're going to think you've gotten rid of these things by repressing the thoughts, repressing the emotions, saying maybe you had thoughts, for example, of you're homosexual or bisexual, or you're gender dysphoric, you're thinking of the other gender a lot, or you're cross-dressing, or you're doing these things, or you're just doing things that in something like Christianity is deemed as sin, like you were drinking, you were having lustful thoughts, any number of things that in that religion you are expected to repent. And this in itself, to me, in my experience, especially what I've learned now over the years, is that it's traumatizing to think that every thought you have to be mindful that it may offend some deity that is supposedly watching you and judging you. Now, mind you, he loves you too, but he's judging, watching, and if you're not repenting, you don't believe in his son, Jesus, which to me is completely distorted history as well. I'm not even sure he existed. He may have. I will say if he did exist, I think his history was propagandized and totally distorted for the sake of controlling people, controlling masses of people with this type of rhetoric and this type of thought, is that if you don't repent for all these different things all of the time, that there's this place of eternal torment where there is Satan or demons or both, and that's where you're going to go and your soul will be there for all eternity being tormented because you're not believing in Jesus, or you're not repenting or doing these things. I have a real issue with that now because, again, I see it as traumatizing, because what happens is when you don't acknowledge that these thoughts are real, you don't acknowledge the emotions are real, you push them back or you repent as if they're not really your thoughts or your actions or your feelings, emotions. Well, what happens is they end up coming back time and time again. They will return. Now, I guess you could say, well, I'll keep repenting about them. I will keep pushing them back. But it's a constant battle because they actually are your thoughts and your emotions that you're not sitting with. You're not spending time with them and acknowledging that they're real, because you have this belief system that there's this entity that is watching and judging everything you do, and that there's a place for you to go, this hell realm where you're going to go for all eternity. So when I was a child, I was brought up into Christianity, and when I was 11 is when I first remember experiencing any form of gender dysphoria. In puberty, I felt feminine a lot. Couldn't explain it. I was a kid. It was 1986. I lived in oftentimes a dysfunctional home. And even though I lived in this dysfunctional home, I had also been taught religion, Christianity. We didn't go to church, but my mom said prayers a lot of times, the typical, you've probably heard the "now I lay me down to sleep" prayer. That was a typical deal, but she would talk about God. She talked sometimes about a hell. No, she didn't constantly hammer it, but it's something she believed. And other people around me, there was a lot of people around me too that believed such things. So at 11 years old, I wasn't going to be like, hey, I'm having these thoughts, girly thoughts or whatever. I just pushed it back because even at that age, yeah, I believed there was this figure in the sky or somewhere or up above, wherever this figure was that was watching me, judging this type of stuff. So when I was 13, though, this came out again, and I wanted to cross-dress when my mom and stepdad were at work. And I'd also look at his dirty books he had in the closet. I found those, but I had gender envy. I wanted to look like the women. And I could not make sense of it for myself then either, but I would get onto myself for being inferior and that there's a hell, and I would repent and I would say all these things. Now, what happened when I look back at this time, I see that as traumatizing, all of it. On top of everything else I dealt with as a child, I see the fact I was taught this program that it was a traumatizing thing. So mind you, my stepdad and mom believed in Christianity, but in the meantime, my stepdad was homophobic and said awful things about gays in that community. And I was pretty much left on an island on my own to deal with sexuality and my feelings in that way. And in 1988, I could not see that would have ever been a good thing to have told them that there were times I felt female or had these really strong feminine urges, feelings. So I repressed it, I pushed it back. I did that so many times. I don't know how many times I would cross-dress and things, but eventually I just got away from it and pushed it back. But I developed OCD, and I often had up and down depression. And as I got up in my teen years, there were a lot of issues. And through my whole childhood, I dealt with bullying and had no real sense of identity. And that comes from a lot of things I've discussed in other videos as well. But what happened, because I repressed these feelings, and a lot of it came from Christianity and from the thought of there being this heaven, this hell. Basically, I was taking my thoughts and my actual feelings instead of dealing with them, and I was attributing them to some demon causing them, or Satan causing them, and then thinking there's some invisible entity that's also going to have it out for me. But at the same time, this entity is supposed to love me too. So yeah, that caused trauma. I could look back and see where that caused trauma, and that's probably the major factor, the religion itself, that caused me to repress what I was going through, and knowing I couldn't tell anybody in that day and time. So In my adult years, it was pretty repressed for the most part, but I had issues with identity all the time and self-worth and self-esteem and always trying to be hyper masculine through the years. And it would come up again. Dysphoria would come up in small increments. I had it pretty much in a buried state, but the thoughts would come up sometimes, attraction to certain men, or and yeah, you could automatically say that was just gay or bisexual, but for me, I always thought of my attraction from a feminine standpoint. Like if I were a woman being attracted to this man, because it'd usually be a straight man I would be attracted to. The thing is, I'm still mostly attracted to women, but I can be attracted to certain men. But when I am, it's usually from a feminine type of standpoint. That can be hard for some people to understand, but to me, it's part of the gender dysphoria. So that would come up from time to time, and I, again, would repent and repress and be hypermasculine and all these things. And I go through these cycles throughout so many years. I go through these cycles that there was this hell and there was this heaven and all of this. So I was repressing the feelings is the point, and it caused trauma by repressing the feelings and never acknowledging the emotions, the feelings, and all of that are actually me, and they were not being dealt with. So when I got to 2021 and the gender dysphoria in me, that's when it really exploded and heightened. And prior to that, I had had an affair with a married woman who, ironically, this is the interesting point, brought me. I had been dabbling with New Age for a long time, and I had dealt with the dark occult for a while. There was like a whole summer in 2020 I dealt with the dark occult and black magic, and she brought me back to Christianity, but then behind her husband was having an affair with me. See, and I look back at that and I'm like, well, okay, so I mean, of course it wasn't right no matter how you look at it, but I mean, was she going home at night repenting? And I knew it wasn't right, but I was going through so much hurt and pain in my life from a series of things at the time, which I've discussed in other videos too. But my point is that I went back into Christianity because of her, yet it was a totally screwed up situation for both of us. And realized again after some time, my life was still going downhill because it wasn't authentic. There was no authenticity. And in 2021, I started feeling very strong gender dysphoria like I had never felt before. And why would that happen? And I can look at it and see why it would happen, because I had been repressing it since I was 11 years old. I had pushed it down, 13 pushed it down. Times it would try to come up again in my adult years, pushed it down. Finally, it was, I was 45. At 45, it decided to come up in a very strong way, and I started feeling at home. So I lived by myself and have for a very long time. And I just started having natural feminine feelings that I wasn't repressing all of a sudden. It's simple things, just the way I started to stop being so hyper masculine. When I would be here alone, I would say, wow, you're really not like that at all. It would be simple things. The way I would sit would be very feminine all of a sudden, and the way I would suddenly walk and do certain things seemed much more natural to me, but they were more feminine. And it's like, wow, this seems all so much more natural to you. And then I started wanting to do more feminine things, like shave my legs, and I started wanting to give myself petties, and I would grow my nails and things like that. And then eventually come around to, I always wore short haircuts, and I started finally growing my hair. And I used to, at first I would tell myself, oh, you're going to grow it to look like certain other men with long hair. Like, I would have the thought, maybe you'll grow it long shoulder lengths and it'll kind of look like what, it's kind of funny, I think about it, but I would think something like, oh, you'll look kind of like Keanu Reeves, his hair length, and John Wick or something like that. But I was again masking that I really wanted it longer to have more of a feminine look. And so the first time I grew it out, I was dealing with some pressure from my parents, because you go through the awkward growth and all of that. And they would say things, rude things about it. And that's something I've dealt with from my parents over the years, especially from my stepdad, which we're not talking. We've had so many issues over kind of this type of stuff, passive aggressiveness. That's something he would do a lot, passive aggressiveness in his statements. They would be like, he'll say something to you in a backhanded way that you end up internalizing, and it hurts for a while. He did that a lot of times. He did it with my hair. But my mom would say little things too, so I ended up cutting it. I've discussed this before, but I got severely depressed by doing that. I instantly regretted it. I'd say within 30 minutes, I was like, why did I do that? I had spent months at that time growing it. And that was in 2023. Went into a severe depression because I let them get to me, which they had over many things over the years. They would get to me with things. I would internalize things they would say. And this was even before I came out that I was gender dysphoric. This is before therapy, because I didn't start therapy until the summer of 24. So I was going through all of this, still not completely admitting gender dysphoria. But I went into a severe depression over cutting my hair, and I ended up deciding right then and there I would not cut it again. Because of how it felt. And I've only had a trim since then. I had my ends recently trimmed because I knew they were past due. But my split ends. But other than that, it's been growing since the summer of 2023. So I went through that, and it wasn't until, well, let's go to the beginning of 2024. 2024, I got back into the occult. I went back into kind of dark occult, but not dark like in the summer of 2020. In summer 2020, I went real dark, and I was real angry and hurt I've discussed the relationship that brought me to self-awareness at the end of 2019, and I was still very much hurt in a bad way at that time. So I went into black magic, and I was self-destructive. I was drinking a lot more. I was dealing with unalive feelings, wanting to unalive like daily for a while during that period. But in 2024, at the beginning of the year, it was more about wanting to connect to certain entities, not out of anger or hurt. I was just feeling more and more feminine. And I was wanting to explore that. So I connected with Lilith, and I connected with Astaroth, and I also was connecting with Lucifer, Satan. But when I say people automatically think of Satan, and again, if you're in a religious program, you're going to immediately associate Satan with biblical stuff and hell, and that's not how I see these entities. Once I started getting into this more, it's not how I see that. It's a deep subject, but anyway, I was getting into the occult in this way to explore, especially with Lilith, more my feminine side. And I was feeling darker at that time, but in a sense of, I was having a lot of lust from a feminine perspective. I was having a lot of wanting to explore my lustful femininity, and I created an Instagram, and I called myself Vanessa, and it was for the purposes of being, I have to admit, I guess, pretty exploitive and exploring that lustful side, but also the gender dysphoria trans woman side that I was thinking of doing. And this was before therapy. This was me starting to say, but this was like an alternative world at this point. It was like a fantasy world, because I had no makeup. I would get on there and I would post half nude, sometimes almost fully, because I realized I had more of a feminine body than I realized, because I'm small and I could pose certain ways, and I would get excited about it because it's like, wow, you can make yourself look pretty feminine on camera. And I could, and I would, but I would use a makeup app that was actually really good. These apps are getting more and more, the AI of these apps are amazing. So I would use a makeup app, and the only other thing though was I was using face apps to kind of alter, because I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to look more, at that time I wanted to look more like a doll, or more appealing to whoever's watching me, man or woman, or other trans women for that matter too. And so I was using these apps. Well, what happened is I would find myself being depressed. I would find myself being deeply depressed, and I know one reason is because I was masking as Vanessa. It was a fantasy-like Instagram where I knew I was forming connections with certain people, but knowing that in real life I could never meet them, or I could never actually form real relationships with these people, because I was partially not real in the way I use these apps. And I started to understand that. I was like, well, what you're doing here is more fantasy. And it was exploration, but I started to form connections with certain people, and then that would be depressing, because I was like, well, you can't really ever meet these people because you're not being authentic. I was going through another stage. I went from hypermasculinity. I was exploring the gender dysphoria, exploring femininity, and working with darker occult elements to do that because of the lust I was feeling. But I wasn't authentic. I still was not authentic. I just went from hypermasculinity to a type of hyper lustful femininity, but I felt like I needed to explore it. And when I look back at it, it had to be done. It was something I needed to go through. But the more complex element of this is that the darker occult, looking back at it, I can see that by delving into that, it helped me explore the shadow side, more of a shadow side of me that needed to be explored, that had been repressed throughout my entire life. It had been pushed down. A lot of the feelings I had, like when I cross-dressed at 13, I was also looking at dirty books of girls in those books and wanting to look like them and be in their position in a way. So there was these lustful thoughts too, and these darker lustful thoughts as well. So now I think I was kind of led into the dark occult to explore more of the shadow side of the feminine feelings that were coming up, these lustful feelings. It's very complex, can be hard for many to understand. I'm just now starting to come into some understanding of it more. As the last 6 years, I've been through a lot of changes and a lot of breakdowns through this self-awareness journey, I would say. So what happened was, eventually I started going into a depression again, because I knew I wasn't really this woman, and I could not meet people in real life because I didn't really have that look, and it made me even more dysphoric, actually, is what started to happen. And I didn't really have the makeup, I didn't have the clothes, and I didn't have all this stuff. So eventually I started to want to unalive again. I started to become extremely isolated again. I started to go through severe depression, and I knew at this point there was so much complication going on in my mind. That's when I sought out therapy. And this was it was around May probably of 24. And the first therapist I had, she could only see me once a month. And I ended up being so desperate and depressed, I went in to see the doctor for hormones. I've told this story before too, but she introduced me to Sabine, which I've said many times, I ended up becoming very attached to her because she brought me through a lot. And I've talked about a lot of this in other videos, but basically we talked about the Vanessa Instagram. We hashed through that. I was able to tell her about my dark occult things. There's some things I have not talked about on here that I've talked to her about. I don't know if I ever will. Who knows, maybe. I share a lot, but I'll just say I could share with her some of the darkest shadow parts of me because I connected with her. I feel like I connected with her soul to soul in that way. And it was very special. And I was able to talk to her about so many different things I was never able to express in my life. And I needed that. And she helped also finalize my beliefs and help bring me through leaving organized religion, leaving the constructs of religion, the controlling mechanisms of it. And she helped also bring me through that, and able to see that what was inside me had been inside me all along. I had just been repressing it. I had been repressing the emotions because of a supposed hell and because of religion, and telling myself, attributing my thoughts and emotions to outside demons and outside forces when really they're inside of me. Not to say there's not outside entities. I'm learning things every day, and I've dealt with a lot of things. I've dealt with the occult. I believe that I have actually summoned entities. I have been on paranormal investigations in my past, and I've witnessed all kinds of stuff. I have seen things, witnessed things, heard things, connected with things. I've had a lot of different experiences on the light spectrum and the dark spectrum. And I'm coming into more understanding of these different elements all of the time. And I'm learning all of the time and striving to further my knowledge on all of this. But Sabine helped bring me through even more. And what happened was I got away from the Vanessa Instagram and I got rid of that eventually. And I got back here on YouTube at some point, but it wasn't until much later in my therapy, November of last year, of 24, I got on here and started really talking about all of this, because by that point I had more understanding. But now, with all of this being said, I've come to a point now, at this point in time, right now, I've come to the understanding of what I believe is an essential source, and I believe we're reincarnated. And this was the other thing about delving into the dark occult. I believe my past life was a woman who was very traumatized, and she dealt with SA. I think she was very lustful, but in a dark way, because of abuses as a child she dealt with. And I think she ended up getting into prostitution and the adult industry. I think she went down a road like that and may have even unalived. And to me, over time, it's made so much more sense as to why I'm gender dysphoric. And this don't speak for everybody's gender dysphoria, because we all have different backgrounds and different reasons that we are gender dysphoric. And as I've discussed, there's different severities of it. But mine, I've discussed before that in deep meditation in nature, I had past life regression, that I saw this lifetime. I saw it in a way of emotions, not exact scenes playing out necessarily, but emotions, feelings. It's hard to explain unless you kind of go through this sort of thing. But I got a lot of the vibe of how she was and how her personality was, and which is weird as I'm talking about my own soul, but I believe because her life was unresolved, and her life ended in such a way that was unresolved, and she had such trauma, these traumas carry over, and they'll carry on in your next life and your next life. And I believe that our memory from past lives is wiped on purpose before we decide to incarnate into a new life, because we want to have fresh experiences. We want to experience things as a soul we haven't experienced in a previous lifetime. But sometimes there can be situations where I think we evolve to a point where our soul wants to resolve certain past life traumas, and sometimes that takes past life regression, or has to have pieces of that remembered to understand why you're going through something like me, like going through this gender dysphoria that I go through. So when I was delving into the occult in 2024, I think it was useful because it brought up that dark shadow of lust, I believe, from my past life. It brought it up for me to feel it again, to go through some motions. I believe when I was being Vanessa on Instagram, I was really feeling who I used to be in a lot of ways. The lustful type of person I was, but it came from, like I said, I think it came through various abuses that I had endured and things of that nature. And it's like, in a lot of ways, I believe that past life still wants to live and still wants to experience. And there was so much pain there that's why I deal with it now. And I still deal with that dark lust, just not on the level I was dealing with it when I was on Instagram doing all of that, but I still deal with it, and I still have dark thoughts and of debauchery and all these things. I mean, they still go through me. I still try to work through them. And I'm not saying all this stuff is not to be deemed a sin where you're going to go to a hell. You need to sit. I've learned there's a difference of sitting with these feelings and letting these thoughts play and analyzing them. There's a difference in that, and then telling yourself that there's some external entity making you think these things and you just pushing them back, so at a later date they just come up again, or you become so angry and tormented by the fact that you keep repressing them, you do unalive, or you do pick up addictions to try to cope with it. And I've done that. I've had the drinking addiction. I've had lust addictions that have been detrimental to me before. All caught up in corn before. I mean, so it's a complex subject that I'm just learning about, dealing with light and dark, but I'm just saying that dealing with that dark occult in 2024, I believe was useful to help me explore my shadow more. So in any case, it's a very complex subject. I do think that religion can help some people. I think people that come to it without indoctrination, people that come to it without social conditioning, people that come to it from their own wanting to learn, or maybe they're going through a tough time and they're looking for something. Maybe they're looking for something to get out of a dark place they're in. Maybe they're wanting to expand their consciousness. So the first thing they find is religion, Christianity or Buddhism or any number of religions out there. Maybe they latch onto one of those. I think that's different because they're exploring, and a lot of times you can use religion as a stepping stone to expand your consciousness further as time goes on. I think that can be very useful, but when you're indoctrinated into it, when you're taught it as a child and you're taught certain things about how if you don't do certain things, there's a hell, or if you're thinking certain things, there's a hell, or if you're not behaving a certain way, that there's punishment, that there's a lot of trauma associated with that, and you're not resolving any of the inner torment you're actually going through. Basically, you're creating your own inner hell that you're never resolving. So with that, that's all I have for now, guys, and I'll talk to y'all later on. Bye.